Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on the shores of Lake Maracaibo. Decades ago, this body of water was the beating heart of the Western Hemisphere's energy dominance. At night, the horizon would glow not with the moon, but with the flaring gas of thousands of oil derricks, a constellation of industrial might that promised an eternal golden age. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the wealthiest nation in South America. It was a country where the middle class flew the Concorde to Paris for shopping trips, and the local slang for ordering goods was "dame dos," give me two, because money was simply no object. Now fast forward to the present day. Stand on that same shore. The air is thick, not with the smell of productivity, but with the acrid stench of leaking crude coating the water in a black, sticky film. The oil rigs stand silent, rusting skeletons jutting out of the polluted waves like tombstones. In the nearby city of Maracaibo, once known as the Saudi Arabia of Venezuela, surgeons in the university hospital are forced to operate by the light of their smartphones because the power grid has collapsed. On the street corner, a former university professor is bartering a silver necklace for a carton of eggs. He holds a stack of banknotes in his hand, millions of bolivars. But they are so worthless that street artists now weave them into handbags to sell to tourists because the paper itself is worth more than the currency's face value. It is a scene that defies the basic laws of economics. We are looking at a nation sitting atop 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest deposit of liquid energy on the planet, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. Geologically speaking, every Venezuelan citizen is walking on a gold mine. Yet, biologically speaking, they are starving. How does a nation with the winning lottery ticket in its pocket end up eating out of garbage trucks? Standard geopolitical narratives often try to paint this as a simple story of socialism versus capitalism, or U.S. imperialism versus sovereignty. But if we peel back the layers of rhetoric, we find something far more disturbing and complex. This was not merely an economic accident. It was a structural suicide. The tragedy of Venezuela is not that it ran out of money. It is that it drowned in it. The crisis we are witnessing is the result of a catastrophic trade-off. For 2 decades, the state dismantled its own productive capacity, its farms, its factories, and its technical expertise, and replaced them with a single intoxicating IV drip of petrodollars. They didn't just spend the wealth, they consumed the engine that created it. We are about to dissect how a modern state cannibalized its own future to survive the present. We will not just look at the breadlines, we will look at the balance sheets, the shadow contracts with foreign powers, and the systemic rot that turned the Venezuelan dream into a cautionary tale for the entire modern world. Venezuela is not a failed state because it is poor. It is a failed state because it is mismanaged rich. The collapse is the direct mathematical result of a political system that prioritized the distribution of wealth over the production of wealth, ultimately selling the nation's sovereignty to foreign creditors to maintain a mirage of prosperity until the lights finally went out. To understand why a nation chooses suicide, we must leave the sweltering, starving streets of Maracaibo and step inside the air-conditioned, gilded halls of the Miraflores Palace in Caracas. It is easy to dismiss the Venezuelan leadership as incompetent madmen driving a bus off a cliff, but that is a dangerous oversimplification. If we view the board through their eyes, we see that every disastrous economic decision they made was, in fact, a rational political calculation designed for one thing: regime survival. The tragedy of Venezuela is not a story of incompetence. It is a story of a fatal hostage situation between the state and its own resources. The game began with Hugo Chávez. A charismatic paratrooper with the gift of gab, Chávez didn't just win elections. He rewrote the psychological contract of the nation. When he swept into power, oil was hovering around $10 a barrel. By the mid-2000s, it had skyrocketed toward $100. Suddenly, the government wasn't just a regulator. It was a deity. Chávez found himself holding a credit card with no limit. He looked at the chessboard and made a decisive move. He dismantled the checks and balances of the old republic and replaced them with direct cash transfers. This was the Petro-State Trap. Chávez destroyed the independent institutions, the courts, the central bank, the media, not just to be a dictator, but to remove any friction between his hand and the oil revenue. He believed that if he could just bypass the bourgeois bureaucracy, he could end poverty overnight. He created the misiones, massive social programs that functioned as a parallel government. They built clinics, subsidized food, and gave out cash. It felt like a miracle to the poor, but in reality, it was a fiscal addiction. The government wasn't investing in the capacity to produce food or medicine. It was simply importing everything using oil money. They turned the entire population into dependents. But then, in 2013, the magician died. Hugo Chávez passed away, leaving the throne to Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver with zero military background and a fraction of Chávez's charisma. And then, the unthinkable happened. The price of oil crashed. Imagine sitting at a poker table. You have been betting with house money for a decade. Suddenly, the house cuts you off. This was Maduro's reality in 2014. The oil revenue, which accounted for 96% of Venezuela's export earnings, evaporated. The logic of the chessboard shifted violently. Maduro faced a binary choice: the economic correction. Cut spending, stop printing money, and allow the currency to float. This would save the economy in the long run, but would cause immediate pain to his support base and likely lead to him losing the next election. The political clampdown: keep printing money to maintain the illusion of solvency, blame imperialist saboteurs for the shortages, and use the remaining scraps of wealth to buy the only loyalty that mattered: the guys with the guns. Maduro chose option 2. He didn't care about inflation statistics. He cared about remaining in Miraflores. Outsiders constantly ask, why didn't the military step in? In most Latin American stories, when the economy tanks, the generals take over. The brilliance and wickedness of the Chavista strategy was that they didn't just politicize the military, they corporatized it. Maduro realized he could not command loyalty through inspiration, so he commanded it through transaction. He handed the keys of the economy to the generals. Do you want to import food? You need the approval of a general running the logistics supply chain. Do you want to drill for oil? You deal with a military-led subsidiary of PDVSA. Do you want access to foreign currency at the official rate? You talk to the National Guard. By placing the military in charge of the lucrative import-export rackets, Maduro made the armed forces complicit in the corruption. A general who is making millions of dollars skimming off food imports has no incentive to overthrow the president. If the regime falls, the general doesn't just lose his job. He goes to prison for corruption or human rights abuses. They were no longer soldiers protecting the Constitution. They were partners in a cartel. They were trapped on the chessboard, glued to the king. While the regime painted a picture of a civil-military union fighting against American imperialism, the internal numbers told a story of industrial slaughter. The propaganda machine blared songs of victory, but the Petróleos de Venezuela, SA, PDVSA, the golden goose, was being bled dry. In a normal country, an oil company reinvests its profits to maintain pumps and explore new wells. In Venezuela, the government treated PDVSA like a piggy bank. They took every cent of revenue to fund political campaigns and pay debts. The result? The infrastructure simply rotted. Production collapse. In the late 90s, Venezuela pumped over 3 million barrels a day. By the height of the crisis, it struggled to pump 700,000. The refining paradox. Despite having the most oil in the world, Venezuela had to import gasoline from Iran and the US because their own refineries had rusted into useless scrap metal due to lack of maintenance and brain drain. This was the hidden reality of the board. The revolution wasn't fighting a war against America. It was fighting a war against mathematics and engineering. The government stopped publishing economic data, inflation rates, GDP, infant mortality, because the truth was an act of treason. They decided to fly blind. Why stay the course? Why not negotiate? By the time the crisis hit its peak, the leadership realized they had crossed a Rubicon. The accusations of narco-trafficking, the cartel of the Suns, the investigations by the International Criminal Court, and the sheer scale of the theft meant that there was no safe exit. For Maduro and his inner circle, holding on to power was no longer about ideology or legacy. It was an existential necessity. Losing power meant losing their freedom, and perhaps their lives. So the game changed. It was no longer about governing a country. It was about liquidating a country to pay for the protection of the palace. And to do that, they would need to start selling the furniture. This brings us to the next horrifying chapter of the saga. The transaction. How do you stay afloat when you have no cash? You start selling things that don't belong to you, including the future itself. By 2015, the Miraflores Palace had run out of legitimate options. The oil price had collapsed, the currency was hyperinflating, and the bond markets of New York and London were effectively closed to Venezuela. The credit card was maxed out. In a functioning democracy, this is the moment of austerity and reform. But as we established, for the Maduro regime, reform was suicide. They needed cash, hard, cold, untraceable cash, to feed the patronage network that kept the military loyal. So Venezuela opened a new chapter, the fire sale. The regime effectively turned the nation into a distress sale asset in a global pawn shop. They began liquidating everything that wasn't nailed down, and then they started ripping up the floorboards too. This phase was not about economics, it was about extraction. The first thing to go was the family silver, or in this case, the gold. For decades, the Central Bank of Venezuela, BCV, in downtown Caracas, held one of the most respectable gold reserves in the Americas. It was the nation's rainy day fund. But starting in 2018, mysterious Russian-made Boeing 757s began landing at the Maiquetía airport. They didn't appear on standard flight trackers. Under the cover of darkness, armored trucks moved tons of gold bars from the BCV vaults to these waiting cargo planes. The destination? Turkey, the UAE, and eventually Uganda. This wasn't a standard central bank swap. It was a clandestine liquidation. Venezuela was selling its sovereign wealth for euros in cash to bypass U.S. sanctions. The gold, stamped with the pride of the Republic, was melted down and vanished into the global market. But when the vaults started to echo with emptiness, the regime turned its eyes to the ground. They created the Arco Minero del Orinoco, the Orinoco Mining Arc. Imagine an area the size of Portugal, carved out of the pristine Amazon rainforest. The government declared it a strategic development zone. But in reality, they declared open season on nature. They invited anyone willing to dig. Multinational corporations, but also wildcat miners, Colombian guerrilla groups, ELN, and criminal syndicates, to tear up the jungle. They bypassed all environmental laws. They poisoned the rivers with mercury to extract gold, coltan, and diamonds. The military, once again, was the gatekeeper. They controlled the fuel for the dredgers and the airstrips for the smugglers. The gold extracted here didn't go into the national treasury. A significant portion flowed directly into the pockets of the deep state elite. It was the literal cannibalization of the country's geography to pay for the regime's survival. While the gold provided cash for bribes and black market imports, the regime still needed billions to keep the lights on. They turned to the only lenders left, China and Russia. But Beijing and Moscow are not charities. They are strategic players who saw a desperate borrower and dictated terms that would make a loan shark blush. China had lent Venezuela over $60 billion throughout the Chávez era. But as Venezuela crumbled, Beijing stopped writing checks. Instead, they enforced a loans for oil repayment mechanism. This created a death spiral. Venezuela was contractually obligated to send hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil to China every day just to pay interest on old debts. Think about the mechanics of this. A tanker leaves the Venezuelan coast full of crude. It sails to China. It unloads. But $0 come back to Venezuela. The shipment is simply a strike-through on a ledger. This meant that even as oil prices recovered slightly, Venezuela saw no benefit. Their main export was already spent 10 years ago. They had mortgaged their future production. Russia played a different game. They were less interested in just money and more interested in geopolitical leverage in America's backyard. Through the state oil giant Rosneft, Russia provided lifelines to PDVSA in exchange for ownership. They didn't just lend money, they took equity. They gained control of key oil fields, and, most controversially, they took a 49.9% lien on Citgo, Venezuela's refining subsidiary located in the United States. This was a masterstroke of predatory lending. If Venezuela defaulted on the Russian loans, Moscow could legally claim ownership of critical energy infrastructure on U.S. soil. The Venezuelan government had effectively pawned their crown jewel to the Kremlin. However, the most devastating transaction was not the gold or the oil. It was the technology transfer, in reverse. A nation's true wealth is not what is in the ground. It is what is in the heads of its people. The most tragic aspect of the crisis was the systematic expulsion of human capital. This started with the famous PDVSA whistle in 2003, where Hugo Chávez fired 18,000 highly skilled engineers, geologists, and managers on live television for striking. But it accelerated into a hemorrhage under Maduro. As hyperinflation made salaries worthless, a senior engineer might earn the equivalent of $5 a month, the experts left. They went to Colombia, Spain, Houston, and Dubai. The technical default. Venezuela didn't just lose workers, it lost institutional memory. Oil extraction is complex. It requires maintaining high-pressure pumps, managing reservoir viscosity, and operating heavy crude upgraders. When the experts left, they were replaced by political loyalists with no technical experience. The result was mechanical carnage. Pipelines burst, refineries caught fire, upgraders clogged up. Venezuela has the oil, but they lost the technology to get it out of the ground. This is the ultimate hidden cost. You can buy back gold. You can eventually pay off debt. But you cannot easily buy back 30 years of engineering experience that has fled to Calgary or Aberdeen. The regime had performed a lobotomy on the nation, trading its brain for a few more years of power. By 2016, the Venezuelan government had run out of money, assets, and goodwill. In any normal political system, this is the moment the regime falls. But the strategists in Caracas, advised by intelligence operatives from Havana, understood something profound. A starving population does not revolt if they are too busy looking for their next meal. Instead of fixing the economy, the regime deliberately broke it in a way that made every citizen dependent on the state for survival. They moved from a strategy of buying loyalty to a strategy of enforcing dependence. They built a structural trap, a labyrinth of laws, currency controls, and digital surveillance designed to ensure that while the country might collapse, the power structure would remain bulletproof. To the outside world, Venezuela's currency controls looked like sheer incompetence. Why maintain an official exchange rate of 10 bolivars to the dollar when the black market rate was 200,000? But it wasn't incompetence. It was the most sophisticated looting mechanism in modern history. The regime created a two-tier reality. If you were a friend of the government, a military general, a cousin of a minister, or a politico, a Bolivarian oligarch, you could buy dollars from the central bank at the subsidized rate of 10. You would then turn around and sell those same dollars on the black market for 200,000. This was an instant 2,000% profit. It was a perpetual motion machine of wealth transfer. The structural trap here was that this system destroyed local production. Imagine you are a Venezuelan farmer. You need to buy seeds and fertilizer at market prices. You cannot compete with a government crony who imports corn from Brazil using official cheap dollars. The system made it mathematically impossible to produce anything inside Venezuela. It forced the entire economy to rely on imports. And who controlled the ports? The military. Who controlled the currency to buy imports? The government. They successfully trapped the entire consumption cycle of the nation into their own hands. The private sector wasn't just defeated, it was structurally rendered obsolete. With local farms dead and supermarkets empty, the people were hungry. The regime's response was the creation of the CLAP, Local Committees for Supply and Production. The CLAP was a box of food: poor quality rice, pasta, oil, and canned tuna, often imported from Mexico or Turkey at inflated prices, another corruption scheme. But it was the only food many families could access. Here is the trap. The food was not a right, it was a reward. Local political commissars controlled the distribution lists. If you protested against Maduro, you were crossed off the list. If you didn't vote in the fraudulent elections, no box for you this month. Hunger became the ultimate tool of social engineering. They created a caloric leash. A population spending 12 hours a day standing in line for a bag of subsidized flour has no energy left to march in the streets. The chaos of the queue became the primary occupation of the citizen. To tighten the knot, the regime introduced the Carnet de la Patria, the fatherland card. This wasn't just an ID card. It was a smart card, developed with the assistance of Chinese technology firm ZTE. It contained a QR code that linked the citizen's identity to their socioeconomic data, their medical records, their voting history, and their receipt of social benefits. The carnet became the key to the trap. Do you want your passport? Scan the card. Do you want your pension? Scan the card. Do you want the CLAP food box? Scan the card. During elections, red points, puntos rojos, were set up right next to polling stations. Voters were told to scan their cards after voting to unlock government bonuses. It created a terrifying psychological panopticon. The state knew everything, and the state was watching. The future had arrived in Venezuela, not as flying cars or smart cities, but as a digital shackle. They used 21st century big data to enforce 20th century authoritarianism. Finally, when the opposition managed to win a landslide victory in the 2015 parliamentary elections, the regime didn't accept defeat. They simply changed the rules of the board game. Maduro convened a National Constituent Assembly, ANC, a supraconstitutional body stacked entirely with loyalists. The ANC declared itself superior to the elected parliament. It usurped the legislative power. It effectively dissolved the republic and replaced it with a permanent de facto state. This was the final bar of the cage. Even if the opposition won an election, the legal structure of the country had been altered so that winning meant nothing. The judiciary, the electoral council, and the prosecutor's office were all fused into a single monolith serving the executive branch. When the trap snapped shut, the regime needed a scapegoat. They blamed the economic war and later U.S. sanctions. While U.S. sanctions, specifically the oil embargo of 2019, certainly tightened the noose, the structural trap was built long before the sanctions hit. The sanctions became a convenient narrative shield. Every failure, the lack of insulin, the power outages, the crumbling water pipes, was blamed on the blockade. This narrative trap created a siege mentality. It allowed the leadership to demand absolute unity. Any criticism was no longer just dissent. It was treason in the face of the enemy. By the end of this phase, Venezuela was no longer a country in crisis. It was a hostage situation disguised as a government. The citizens were trapped inside a collapsing building, but the exits, financial, political, and physical, had been welded shut by the very people who claimed to be their saviors. If the previous chapters were the diagnosis of a slow-moving cancer, this chapter is the sudden heart attack. For years, the Venezuelan crisis was a slide, a gradual decline in living standards that people learned to adapt to. They queued longer, they ate less, they patched up their old clothes. But systemic rot is like termites in a wooden house. You don't see the damage until the moment the roof caves in. That moment arrived on the afternoon of March 7, 2019. At 4:55 p.m., the Guri Dam, the hydroelectric colossus in Bolivar State that generates 80% of the country's electricity, failed. It wasn't just a flicker. A brush fire near the transmission lines, combined with turbines that hadn't been serviced in decades, triggered a cascade failure. The sensors tripped, the breakers opened, and the heart of the nation stopped beating. For 5 days, Venezuela plunged into the dark ages. This was the shock. It was the physical manifestation of 20 years of neglect. Modern civilization is fragile. It hangs on the thin wire of electricity. When that wire snapped, the veneer of the 21st century evaporated instantly. The hospitals, neonatal incubators shut down. Surgeons finished operations by the light of cell phones. Dialysis machines stopped, sentencing thousands of kidney patients to a slow, toxic death. The water. Without electricity, the pumps couldn't push water up to the apartments in Caracas. People descended to the polluted Guaire River, essentially an open sewer, to fill buckets for drinking and bathing. The rot. In a tropical country, food spoils in hours. The little meat families had hoarded in their freezers turned into poison. The smell of rotting food mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies. The regime blamed an electromagnetic attack by the United States. But the engineers knew the truth. The system hadn't been attacked. It had simply died of old age and exhaustion. While the grid collapsed physically, the economy collapsed mathematically. Hyperinflation entered a phase that defied logic. We are not talking about prices rising. We are talking about the dissolution of the concept of value. At its peak in 2018-2019, inflation hit numbers that looked like typos, 1,000%, then higher. The currency, the bolivar, became hot potatoes. If you received money, you had to spend it within minutes, because by the afternoon, it would buy half as much. The weight of cash. People stopped counting money. They started weighing it. A cheese empanada cost a brick of bills the size of a shoebox. The barter economy. In the countryside, the economy reverted to the medieval era. Haircuts were paid for with bananas. Parking was paid for with cigarettes. The sovereign currency of the state was replaced by the primitive exchange of goods. This was the moment the social contract shattered. A government's most basic duty is to provide a medium of exchange. When the money died, the state ceased to function as an economic entity. When the lights go out and the money dies, the laws of man are replaced by the laws of the jungle. The most terrifying example occurred in the state of Zulia. During the blackout, police effectively abandoned the city of Maracaibo. What followed was not a political protest. It was an industrial-scale looting spree. Mobs tore through 500 businesses. They didn't just steal food. They stole industrial mixers, toilet seats, and window frames. They stripped a Pepsi factory down to the bare concrete walls. This was the Hobbesian moment, the war of all against all. It wasn't the poor stealing from the rich. It was the desperate stealing from the slightly less desperate. The facade of solidarity that the socialist regime had preached for decades crumbled into absolute chaos. Neighbors looted neighbors. The collapse then moved from the streets to the bodies of the citizens. The term, the Maduro diet, became dark gallows humor, but the statistics were horrific. The annual Encovi survey revealed that the average Venezuelan lost 11 kilograms, 24 pounds, of body weight in a single year due to food scarcity. But worse than the hunger was the return of the ghosts. Diseases that had been eradicated 40 years ago, malaria, diphtheria, measles, came roaring back. As the healthcare system collapsed, 90% shortage of medical supplies, Venezuela became a biological hazard zone. Malaria spread from the illegal mines in the south, carried by mosquitoes and desperate miners, infecting hundreds of thousands. The state, once the proud provider of healthcare, had become an incubator of plague. Finally, the pressure became too great to contain. The collapse triggered the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere, bigger than Syria at its peak relative to the region. The image that defines this era is the Simon Bolivar International Bridge connecting Venezuela to Colombia. Every day, tens of thousands of people walked across it. They carried suitcases, children, and their entire lives on their backs. They weren't just leaving. They were fleeing. The brain drain, complete. The doctors left. The teachers left. The mechanics left. The hollow nation. Entire neighborhoods in Caracas became ghost towns. Schools sat empty because the teachers had emigrated, and the students were too weak from hunger to attend. By 2020, nearly 7 million Venezuelans, more than 20% of the population, were living abroad. This was the final stage of the collapse, the evacuation. The country had become so uninhabitable that the only rational choice for a quarter of the population was to walk hundreds of miles through the Andes Mountains to escape. The revolution had promised to create a new man. Instead, it created a new diaspora. The dust has now settled over the ruins of the Venezuelan economy. But if you walk through the Las Mercedes district in Caracas today, you will not see a war zone. You will see a Ferrari dealership. You will see shiny glass storefronts known as bodegones. Inside, the air conditioning is crisp, and the shelves are stocked with Kirkland signature vitamins from Costco, jars of Nutella from Italy, and single malt scotch. The customers pay in crisp $100 bills, the faces of Benjamin Franklin passing from hand to hand in the capital of the anti-imperialist revolution. This is the final, cruelest irony of the saga. After 20 years of swearing to destroy American capitalism, the regime survived by capitulating to it. To stop the hyperinflation that threatened to topple them, the government quietly legalized the US dollar. They admitted that their own currency, and by extension their own economic sovereignty, was a failure. Venezuela has not recovered. It has mutated. When we conduct the final forensic audit of this tragedy, we must ask, who actually won? The winners. The regime. Against all odds, they remain in the Miraflores Palace. They proved that a government does not need a functioning economy to survive. It only needs a functioning security apparatus and enough cash to pay the Praetorian Guard. They successfully privatized the state for their own survival. The creditors, China, Russia, and Iran, secured their geopolitical foothold. They now own significant chunks of the country's future resources. They bought a nation at a foreclosure discount. The enchufados, the plugged-in. A new class of billionaires has emerged, those connected to the government who control the import monopolies. They live in a bubble of luxury that rivals Dubai, completely detached from the nation they inhabit. The losers, the middle class. The teachers, doctors, and engineers, the backbone of any civilized society, have been wiped out. They are now the new poor, earning less than taxi drivers. The future. The 7 million young people who fled were not just refugees. They were the demographic dividend. Venezuela has aged decades in just a few years. The hands needed to rebuild the country are currently washing dishes in Lima or delivering food in Madrid. The story of Venezuela is a warning to the world, not just about socialism, but about the nature of power and resources. It teaches us that extraction is not production. Venezuela fell into the trap of believing that wealth is something you find in the ground, rather than something you create through human ingenuity and institutions. They treated their economy like a piñata, something to be smashed open and consumed. They forgot that once the candy is gone, you are left with nothing but broken paper. It also teaches us a dark lesson about the resilience of authoritarianism. We used to believe that economic collapse leads to political change. Venezuela proved the opposite. Poverty is a tool of control. A population fighting for daily survival has no energy to fight for democracy. By destroying the private sector, the state made itself the only provider of life, essentially holding the biological needs of the population hostage. If you return to Lake Maracaibo one last time, the oil is still there. It bubbles up to the surface, coating the shores in black sludge, suffocating the fish and the birds. The resources didn't go anywhere. The gold is still in the mountains. The oil is still in the belt. But the nation, the shared dream of a prosperous, free, and vibrant society, has evaporated. Venezuela stands today as a zombie state, structurally dead, yet animated by a dark momentum of illicit finance and geopolitical patronage. It serves as a monumental tombstone for the idea that a country can simply spend its way to greatness without the hard, unglamorous work of building institutions, protecting property rights, and telling the truth. The lights may have flickered back on in Caracas, but the country is still navigating a very long, dark night.